thank you so much, both Paul and Don, for making the science very understandable and walking us through it. I'm very, very impressed with your ability to translate these very technical things into ordinary language that the rest of us can understand. We're now going to hear from David Gordon, who's an environmental lawyer who's been working with Rachel, and he's going to sort of talk about options for those of us in Bronxville who feel strongly that we've got to get this testing done.
Thank you and good evening. What I'd like to, those were really, really good presentations, and we saw an awful lot of technical detail. And what I'd like to try to do is to break it down in terms of where we stand, in terms of governmental action, the programs that are involved, and the ability of people to try to influence that, and so that you can make your own decisions as to what you think needs to be done and to have your voice heard. Just to back up a step, I'm not sure how clearly it was stated. We got involved in this. Obviously, this site, this dump, has existed for many, many, many years. It was active as a dump site for about 25 to 30 years and has been inactive for a while as it got slowly filled in. We've gotten involved because there's now a proposal to come along and put a hotel on it, a Marriott Spring Hill Suites, about 150 rooms, and a restaurant as well. And the reason why we've gotten involved in terms of this level of toxic analysis is because the developer, who's a local developer, who's actually doing this, for Marriott, but it's not being done by them, has looked to tap into a particular program run by the State Department of Environmental Conservation. You heard certainly Don, I think maybe Paul as well, refer to the DEC. That's the State Department of Environmental Conservation. It's our state's EPA, the people who run the environmental programs. And there is a program that they run which is called the Brownfield Cleanup Program, or BCP. And that is a program which is, it seems to us now as the role of the program is to clean up this site. But it's only partially a cleanup program, and it's not really a full cleanup program, and that's part of the reason why this is a problem. The Brownfield Cleanup Program more looks toward sites that are contaminated, but not really super contaminated, not like an old toxic waste dump. Think in terms of a gas station, perhaps, in an urban environment, let's say in a downtown, where over the years there have been spills. And now somebody wants to come along and build something new in the downtown. Now, if we didn't allow them to build it without maybe a full cleanup and everything, and which may or may not be necessary, that site would never get redeveloped. And the downtown would suffer, and people would just move out to the suburbs. And we've come to realize, over the last few decades, that that's not a result that we want. We want to encourage redevelopment in downtown, some of which have some contaminated sites. And so this program encourages developers to come in and redevelop these sites. They're called brownfields. And the way that they're encouraged to do so is that they will get funding from the state to assist with the cleanup. And the cleanup isn't always at the level that you would expect of a major dump, of a major hazardous waste dump. It's, clean up a little bit of the soil and take certain steps that prevent further contamination of the public. For example, paving it, and making sure that there's going to be no kids playing in and nobody's going to be gardening there, nobody's going to be playing in the soil there, it's just going to be people driving onto it. So there's a different level of tolerance for that. The reason I'm going through this in some detail is because it's very, very important to understand what the administrators of this program are thinking as they look at this application. It's important to understand that a brownfield cleanup is at the suggestion of the applicant. For the most part, as in many DEC programs, as in many actually local planning programs, it's designed by the applicant. The applicant thinks up something, proposes it, designs it, brings it to DEC for an okay. That's exactly what's happened here. And the cleanup that's going to happen is that there's going to be a little bit of cleanup, and Don can probably speak to it in more detail, but nowhere near the level of the contamination. But the most critical thing that's going to happen here is just like many, many other brownfield sites, it's going to get paved over. The developer's going to put a hotel on it, and they're going to put a restaurant on it, and the entire rest of the site is going to be paved over in order to separate the contaminants from the people. And by the way, I want to be very, very clear, and this is another very important aspect of it, so I want to emphasize it. When we talk about the site within the brownfield cleanup program, that's the site the developer wants to redevelop. In this case, it's about 3.5 acres. It's going to include the hotel, the restaurant, and the parking lot. That's not the same as the toxic dump. And Paul and Don laid out the map for you. There was a lot of lines on it. It may have been hard to see. But the toxic dump was these, if you remember, were these two huge pools of, originally they were the quarry, then they filled up with water, and then they were filled up with whatever they were filled up with, stretching for many, many hundreds of feet. And the brownfield cleanup site is only going to be in the middle of that. That's really the middle 3.5 acres. So the things to remember is there's plenty, we can't be sure because the testing didn't occur off the site, off the brownfield site, but there's, in all likelihood, a lot of toxic dumping happening out of the brownfield cleanup site. Well, why didn't they test for that? The answer again comes back to the administrative issue. It's very, very important to understand the administrative component here, not just the environmental component. From a DEC perspective, the entire issue, the entire site is the developer's brownfield cleanup site, the 3.5 acres. They don't test outside the site because it's literally not in the program. It's outside the program. It's just there like it was there before, and it would still be there even if the developer had never come along. So the two takeaways from this is that there are certain areas of the old dump that have not been tested at all. That in all likelihood, we're surmising based on the history, and the history here is, as Don described, there are people who watched this over the years. We have anecdotal evidence, we have affidavits, we have reports from the fire commissioners, people who saw this over time. We know that there was a lot of dumping going on through the whole site. But the point here is to understand the dynamic. From the DEC perspective, and the DEC is the government, and the government is in charge of the program, this is a limited objective program to, again, it's not to clean up the environment, it's to get this site back in use, to get it back on the tax rolls, to get it back to be economically productive. And in this case, the economic productivity we're talking about is a very nice, very big hotel, which a lot of folks rightfully really want to see. And so DEC is not in the business of throwing wrenches into that, and that is not what's happened so far. The question for us is, are we satisfied with this? The evidence is clear. This was an old abandoned dump. There is a lot of toxicity in it. There's a lot of chemicals in it. It exceeds the standards in a number of places. And so the trick for us is trying to, this is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, is how do you get DEC to recognize this overall issue, not just as a brownfield cleanup issue, but rather as what is called an inactive hazardous waste dump, which is really what this animal is, but they haven't come to that yet. And the other thing to think about is that this consideration of the site as a brownfield cleanup site is already pretty far down the road at both the local level and at the DEC level. As Don explained, we've already gone through a phase where there is what's called a remedial investigation report. And they went back and forth on it a little bit. We had some input into that, and that report was finalized about February 12th. So it was about almost 3 weeks ago. And that's an important first phase because essentially, and Don can explain this in more detail during the question and answer, but that's basically the testing phase. That's the what do we know phase, remedial investigation report, and that's now finalized. The next phase, which is coming up, and we understand from DEC that is coming up within a few weeks, is the remedial action work plan. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. That's the work plan. That's the cleanup phase. That's the report that says this is what we're going to clean up. What DEC has told us is that that's going to be released in a form that the public can comment on in about 2 weeks. And then from that point, the public is going to have 45 days to comment. That's our big chance to step in, the comment period on the remedial action work plan. And again, the issue that we're facing is how to approach this, which is currently a brownfield proposal. And what I would suggest and what I would throw out for consideration is that the important thing here is to get DEC, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, to re-understand this site as not simply a brownfield proposal on 3.5 acres in Tuckahoe, but rather an abandoned, what's in DEC parlance, an inactive hazardous waste disposal site, which requires much more extensive cleanup, much more extensive, before you even get to the cleanup, much more extensive diagnosis, much more extensive testing. And by extensive, I mean both geographically, so we're going to spread out a little bit farther north, a little bit farther south, get off that BCP site and take a look what's out there, and also much more extensive in terms of every, going down deeper in the soil. This site goes down to, that old dump goes down to well more than 100 feet in a number of places. The testing didn't go down that far, even on the BCP site. So that's the box that we're in right now. I'll also point out that the town actually did have some review authority over this because this was part of a development proposal. And for those of you, there's not as much development perhaps going on in Bronxville. I'm not as familiar with Lower Westchester, but in other parts of the state, there's a lot of development going on. And every time there's a development, you have to go ahead and do an environmental review. And the environmental review is supposed to look at all the issues. And that's exactly the position that the Tuckahoe Planning Board was in about 5 months ago. And what they chose to do is, there's a state law, I'll just back up one step and explain. There's a state law called the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which is the law that requires environmental impact review. So of really anything that a town or a village does, including permitting somebody else's development or somebody else's project. And this happens in every development project, and they got to look at it and figure out if it's going to hurt the environment. And what Tuckahoe did, what the Tuckahoe Planning Board did when presented with all this, they could have said, we're going to hold back on determining whether or not we're going to do an environmental impact statement. We're going to force you to go through this whole process. We're going to watch over it very carefully. They didn't do that. They chose instead, last September, which is now almost 6 months ago, to do, basically to say this is not going to require an environmental review, but and for those of you who are familiar with the State Environmental Quality Review Act, it's called a NEGDEC, negative declaration. But they said, we're going to do something. We're going to do something that's a little bit different. We're going to do a condition negative declaration, and the condition is you got to listen to what DEC says. So essentially, the Planning Board in Tuckahoe could have had review authority on this because they were reviewing a development proposal for site plan review, and as part of their environmental impact review, they could have essentially been a part of this process. And had jurisdiction over it. And what they said is, we're just going to give it a negative declaration, but on the condition that you go through the DEC process. And that removed them from having really any authority and jurisdiction over it. Then, having done that and realized what they did, and some of the people that were concerned about it, they went ahead and hired an environmental consultant to watch DEC anyway. So they are watching the process in Tuckahoe, but they don't really have authority over it anymore because they've already neg-decked it. And the toxic review is not really part of the site plan review. So they're in the site plan phase now. They're going to hold off on it until the brownfield cleanup is finished. But the bottom line is, in terms of having direct authority, the Tuckahoe Planning Board has factored itself out. They still have site plan review. But basically, the ball's in DEC's court. And DEC looks at this as a brownfield site. And that's precisely the situation that we're in right now. And the rubber's going to meet the road basically in 2 weeks, at which point we'll have 40, depending when it comes out, we'll have 45 days to comment on it. So that's the nutshell situation that we're in. Obviously, we can get into great detail on this. Don has really crunched the chemical contamination better than the DEC remedial investigation report, which was actually, of course, prepared by the developer. So there's a number of technical issues in terms of how we compare the findings to what the criteria are and the cleanup and all that. But the bottom line is, unless the state rethinks its approach to this site, the cleanup is going to be a hotel, a restaurant, and paving over it, under the presumption that as long as you pave over it, there's going to be no kids playing in the soil, so there's going to be no contamination. Now, what makes this site very interesting and very inappropriate for this, even if the contamination was less than it was, is the fact that Paul brought forward, which is that we know that the groundwater flows through the site to the south. Now, I'm going to say very clearly, because I promised Si I was going to say it, I'm going to say it. We can't tell you whether any of that toxic contamination in Tuckahoe is ever getting to Bronxville. We know that the water generally comes to Bronxville and probably goes into the Bronx River, but the question I've been asking from the beginning is, okay, so there's these drums up there, there's these chemicals up there, that's a mile away from here. Do those chemicals survive all the way down to Bronxville? And the answer is we don't know. And so we're not going to tell you that where we stand right now is on top of toxic chemicals, because we just do not know. And it would be, we can't come down here and say that, and we won't. But the truth is we don't know. And the truth is this will not get tested because DEC doesn't look at this problem within the brownfield cleanup program because we're off the site. If it was a Superfund site, translated into bureaucratese, that's an active hazardous waste site, we might get that level of testing. And that's the message for you, is to determine whether or not this is a level of concern to the point where you want to ask DEC, the DEC commissioner, and your state representatives to rethink where this project is and where this site is, whether it gets paved over and essentially gets put into some bureaucratic box that looks at the 3.5 acres and the rest of it gets left for another day, or whether we look at it now. So that's the summary of where things are at now in terms of the basic jurisdictional levels. And of course, like I said, the science that's been done is really going to add to it. And if there's nothing else, I think we can open it up to questions.
Thank you very, very much. That was an excellent explanation. We're going to do questions and answers. Vicki is going to collect them. I'll read them. There's one back there. Here's the first one. Okay. We can start. Okay. Okay.
I'll announce it if you
Oh,
want.
right, I get it. Okay, first, the first question is written below, so but I'll read the first one first. Okay, what impacts are there on homes which have contaminated groundwater running underneath them at 20 feet, at 30 feet, at 10 feet, underneath their foundation? And then I'll read the second question. I think that's a question that's separate from the other one. So this is, what's the effect on a home if there are contaminants in groundwater running under the home and at different levels?
Oh, okay. So if you have volatile organic compounds like the TCE and the perchloroethylene, that can volatilize out of the groundwater and become a soil vapor intrusion kind of issue. Okay. It would not be an issue if you're not drawing on that groundwater and drinking it, then metal contamination is not going to be an issue. But things that can volatilize could be an issue.
I'd like to add to that. Don is referring to a phenomenon called volatilization, which is when certain chemicals, not all these chemicals that we're concerned about, actually very easily go from a liquid state or dissolved in liquid to becoming part of the air. That's an issue on the site. There are volatile chemicals that are coming off of the site directly up into the air. Rachel Zolotov's building, where she has the martial arts studio, is, at this point, we've convinced DEC to test for that, to see whether this is something that took them a long time to come around to. And remember, her particular building is right next to the, I'm not sure if you saw it on the map, it's essentially right next to the old quarry. It's right in the middle of it. And so they're going to start looking at hers. For the buildings that are being built, the hotel and the restaurant, the DEC is going to require essentially a system to route the potential volatile chemicals out of the building, so the people who are staying overnight in the hotel and people eating in the restaurant are not going to be subject to these chemicals. They're just going to go up into the air. One of the questions that we have is, well, will that affect the homes in the area? DEC has not so far agreed. Have they tested the homes? Don?
No, not yet.
Yeah, so this is one of those sub-issues that we're trying to essentially pull DEC around to look at, but again, there's resistance. What I explained to you in the overall, that this is within one program, it's not just an overall concept, there's a lot of sub-details, and this is one of them, trying to get them to at least begin testing, you know, the homes that are in the area, the businesses that are in the area. There's a church that's at the southern end of the Quarry. There's a lot of people that live around here. So for some of the chemicals, not all of them, but some of the chemicals that volatilize, the air emissions become a very important issue, even if you're not drinking the groundwater, as essentially long as you're located on top of it.
Okay, next question. Could a reason that we see a dramatic increase in levels of contaminants in a well be because the barrels are corroding and releasing the contaminants?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Even, I think I might have been able to answer that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to read this. Is there precedent for overturning a brownfield site from the cleanup plan
From the BCP program.
to an actual hazardous cleanup site? So in other words, has this kind of transition taken place before, where you start with a brownfield site and then it becomes the other kind of site?
I'm not personally aware of an example where a BCP site has been turned into an inactive hazardous waste site, but that's not to say it hasn't happened.
Okay,
We don't know.
okay, but none that we know of, or you know of.
Well, I will say this, Randy Witcher, who's the project manager for this site, said that sometimes they'll do a composite where they will retain the BCP site and then add the inactive hazardous waste site around it or next to it. So then it's handled, and I can't imagine how that's administratively handled, because you're talking about, you have one site, but part of it's administered under one program and part of it's administered under a different program. It seems
That's also not
awkward.
legal. I mean, the BCP program, again, is targeted for, you know, lightly, if there's such a thing as lightly contaminated sites, you know, spills and things like that. But specifically, if a site is what's called a Class 1 or a Class 2 hazardous waste site, which is, you know, that's basically what we're looking at here, is a Class 2 hazardous waste site, it's excluded from the BCP program. You can't just come in and redevelop a Class 2 hazardous waste site for exactly this reason. You need them cleaned up. So the hybrid that ran, I mean, by the way, just because DEC talks about it doesn't mean, you know, the fact that it's illegal doesn't necessarily mean DEC's not doing it. And these folks may be inventing the wheel as they go along. One of the things to remember about this agency, and I don't think I'm speaking too far out of school, is that over the years it has suffered very, very severe losses in personnel. Going back to, I've been an environmental attorney here for 25 years, and going back even to the Cuomo administration back then, and certainly afterwards, whenever the state needed to cut its budget, which it means every 2 or 3 years, DEC is one of the first agencies that they look to for significant budgetary cuts. So you're dealing with a significantly understaffed agency, and so, and I don't mean to necessarily be pejorative, but if corners get cut every so often and things get moved from one thing to another, if nobody's looking, that wouldn't be the first time that happened. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do.
Okay, next question is kind of similar. Why doesn't the DEC recognize the site as an inactive hazardous waste disposal site? Don't the testing results prove that it is such a site?
Well, the answer to the second question is yes, in my opinion. The answer to the first question is because in a lot of areas of environmental regulation, things are not self-enforcing. The government does, the government just doesn't always pick up the data and do the thing that they should do because of the reasons I'm stating. It's in a different program. There's not a lot of administrative support and frankly, I'll answer it a different way. The way to get it done, the way to break through that logjam is public and political support. If people don't, things will happen by inertia unless people demand that they do something otherwise. If enough people demand it, probably we will be able to get some movement. So I'd rather restate it positive. So to answer the way it's drafted, because nobody's demanded it yet.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, this I think has been covered, but I'll read it. Was groundwater tested at the approximate inlet north of site and at the Bronx River outlet south? What were the toxicity levels? And I think that's what we're saying has not been done, right?
Not been done.
Yeah, okay.
No.
Then ultimately, what is our resource?
Let me just
sorry.
add that, I mean, normally at hazardous waste sites, even gas stations, you would monitor the groundwater up gradient from the site, and you would monitor it down gradient from the site. In fact, there's a requirement in the BCP program that the applicant has to deal with contaminants moving off site. And I don't understand how they can do that without even knowing what's going off site. It seems like just a fundamental flaw in the design of the program.
Can I add to that just once more? The idea that we have conduits moving some contaminants rapidly off-site and straight down to the Bronx River is a whole nother type of testing procedure that's done. Normally, in the up-gradient and down-gradient testing that are done in non-limestone or marble-type terrains, wells will suffice. But in fact, in an area where we have rapid groundwater flow in conduits in part, then there are special ASTM standards to deal with testing in what's called karst terrains, and that looks at where the spring resurgences come out in the river, where is that conduit, and what's moving through it rapidly. So it would require multiple testing, which is not just wells on site.
Next it's a follow-up on the same card. Ultimately, what is our recourse during the comment phase? Demand it be designated as a Superfund site, and to whom specifically, I'll add on, to whom specifically would comments be addressed?
The answer is yes. Demanding that it be handled as a Superfund site and tested for that is probably a very good approach. And I would even suggest you don't have to wait to the comment period, because that's a comment period on the remedial action work plan. It's certainly appropriate at that phase, but if you wanted to write the commissioner tomorrow and say this has to be handled in this way, that you always have a right under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution and similar provisions of the New York Constitution, you have a right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I mean, when we say those words, we kind of envision people with fifes and drums and three-corner hats, but the truth is you have the right to demand your government do something, and that's a constitutional right, and you can do it. Sometimes people say to me, well, do I have to wait for a public comment period? You don't. You certainly can, and you certainly can write then, but you can also go home tomorrow and write a letter if you want, or call somebody. And obviously the people to reach out to, certainly outside the comment period, if you were to do so, would be the commission of the DEC. And if you didn't get immediate action from them, and you very well might not, we are also recommending that you reach out to your state legislators, your state representatives. Superfund actually primarily refers to a federal program, although it's done at the state as well. This goes back to 1980, and 79-80, and the discovery in New York State of Love Canal, which was sort of the mother of abandoned hazard. I mean, there was the toxic chemicals were in the ground. They were bubbling up. There were schools nearby. This was outside of Niagara Falls, New York. And in response to that, the Congress passed a law, which I forget what, CERCLA. That's an acronym for a longer name, but it became known as Superfund, and it did two things. It actually set up a pot of money, so that if the site was truly abandoned, if nobody could be found to pay for it, then there would be a federal pot of money to pay for this. And that pot of money was created by taxing the chemical industry. But it also said, if we can find anybody who was ever responsible for this, they could be forced to pay for any or all of it. And that became known as, and of course, because of that structure, it was extremely controversial. And once the fund got spent down, and especially once Congress got a little bit more conservative, it became very difficult. It was more difficult to get it reauthorized, and I'm not even sure how viable the program is anymore. But I was essentially using that as a shorthand for what formerly would be known as the state inactive hazardous waste site. I was using it essentially as a shorthand because that's basically is the cleanup program for abandoned dumps.
Okay.
Well, there's both it operates at both the state and the federal level. Okay, so there's federal.
Is there an existing state superfund?
There's a state, well, the inactive hazardous waste program is also called the Superfund.
Does DEC have a pot of money that they can go ahead and tap into if they can't find
Yes.
it? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Environmental, the Environmental Quality Bond Act, I think, is
Provides-
what
okay.
has funded that.
So the Bond Act that we voted on a few years ago provided a pile of money that did go into the state superfund. So even if DEC couldn't find anybody responsible here, and they probably can, they can go ahead and get this thing moving. And so that might be another angle you'd want to take. You got the money, spend the money. It was our money that we bonded, spend the money.
Okay, next one. What relationship does this have to Bronxville's drinking water?
It's my understanding that you have public drinking water,
Yeah.
so no direct relationship. The impacts would be volatilization of the groundwater up to the homes, contamination of the groundwater flowing into the Bronx River, where you could have a bioaccumulation of metals and other toxic substances, where kids might play, for example, and it might adversely impact different ecosystems, fish and others.
Okay. The next question I think has already been answered. Then there's, does the EPA have a role to play? So that would be the Federal Environmental Protection Agency.
I would say yes, that they do. They tend to delegate. I mean, the EPA is ultimately the enforcer of national environmental laws. If this site was deemed to be sufficiently hazardous, it could potentially become a federal Superfund site. And I think they have. It's fair to say that EPA has authority over the site in terms of surface water protection, such as what Paul just referred to, is if there's contaminants that can be shown that are coming from the site and going to the Bronx River and polluting the Bronx River, EPA would have jurisdiction over that. They may have jurisdiction, they do have jurisdiction over air quality. It's a balancing act. So the EPA gives authority to the states, but they are the overseers of many of these laws. The federal, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and so forth.
Okay. Next one is, does Eastchester have a role to play?
Eastchester.
So
Well-
Eastchester is our town, and the village of Tuckahoe and Bronxville lie within
There's-
the town.
There's two possible answers. One is any citizen can have an active role to play in terms of commenting and petitioning the government, in this case the DEC and the governor. Equally, your local town, your local town board, your local supervisor can have a role in petitioning as well on behalf of the town board and also on behalf of the people. And in some ways, very often, whether it's right or wrong, state officials will respond more strongly to the expressed opinions of local public officials than they will to individual citizens. So in terms of representing your interests, your town supervisor and your village mayor here in Bronxville can speak out and receive a certain amount of dignity simply because they are public officials representing a constituency. The other thing, again, is that there was a local angle on this. It was actually, the Tuckahoe Planning Board. And they still do have, so Tuckahoe Planning Board is still looking at this because after they did the condition negative declaration, which was awful because it took away their jurisdiction, then they went and hired somebody to look at it. And so they are actually actively looking at it, perhaps commenting on it. Now, that's the village of Tuckahoe. That's not the town of Eastchester. Now, I don't know offhand what level of influence the town of Eastchester has over the village of Tuckahoe, but to the extent that there is, this might be a way to communicate with the village of Tuckahoe and with the planning board to make sure that their professional that they hired does the best job that he can.
Okay, thank you. Next one is, can we do some water testing privately?
I think not readily. First, it's very expensive, and second, you're not sure where you would want to test. If you're looking at the cave-bearing, rapid transport flow route, where we don't even know where the springs are at this point to test. That would be a key component. In terms of off-site contamination, first, the public at large should not be out there testing this water and handling it. Okay, this is something done by trained professionals who know how to deal with these substances. So I'm discouraging you to do it. And this is not the role of the public to have to do DEC's testing. This should be done because it's done through the proper channels.
What alternative, though, do people have? In other words, if you can't get an agency to go test and you want to really establish, yes or no, there's something flowing down into Bronxville from the quarry.
Well, anyone can have their water tested. If you had wells, certainly you could purge them to get a representative groundwater sample, 3 well-bore volumes, and take a sample and analyze for a suite of all organics, metals. Bronx River is a key place that should be monitored. However, I would say before we do any monitoring there, an effort needs to be made to find one or more, most likely one, spring outflow from the groundwater flow system. The way these cave systems work, the conduit parts, if you think of a maple tree and start at the top, you have all these little tributaries that come down into a bigger and bigger trunk passage at the base. Well, the cave system's sort of like that. Here, it's sandwiched between 2 impermeable rock layers, so we know geologically it has to come out in a certain part of the river. Someplace along that river, or perhaps a little bit upgrading of it, there must be some one or more springs. These should be investigated and found, because this would be some of the very best places to sample versus a random river sample. You're not going to know what you're sampling in. It might be a contaminant source upriver.
Okay, if I could just ask a follow-up. So when you say we don't know where to sample, what needs to be done to know? In other words, trace those water sources, like the springs?
There are standard testing for the conduit parts of the aquifer, and that includes tracer testing and investigation of spring outflow sources. There's a standard karst investigation, cave-bearing conduit type investigation, but that's only part of it. If you're going to do groundwater testing off-site, you're also going to look at wells, and you're going to start close to the site boundary. You're going to finish testing both the north and south within the waste-filled quarry segments, and then you're going to work your way down gradient from there. So it's a mixed bag.
Well, what didn't the DEC deny Davis course?
I think they may have, yeah.
One of the complications in this is that when Paul originally communicated with DEC to let them know that some of the geology here was susceptible to these, what Paul's calling conduits, basically it means that the bedrock, because it's susceptible to it, has essentially dissolved and made sinkholes and underground rivers. The DEC folks basically denied it. They said that the evidence that Paul had cited was not convincing to them. So from a bureaucratic perspective, the underground conduits at this point don't exist. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. It means that for DEC's purposes, they don't exist. So that's another one of the, again, it's not just a bureaucratic issue in terms of we're in the wrong program. It's also that because there is limited resources there and they have a certain mission, then they just going to not see certain things. And so there are differences of technical opinion, and the existence of these underground conduits, these underground rivers, if you will, that rapidly move the groundwater is one of those differences of opinion.
Just to add to that, there's no question that they're carceral. I showed you a diagram of streams sinking into the subsurface. Obviously, they go someplace. If you have a sinkhole in the ground, what's happened is the ground that was formerly level has been sapped away underneath. And in order for that sapping to occur, the material in it has to be carried effectively away. Groundwater is definitely moving through these conduits. We know they're there. So you have to identify that. Now, I should say, while DEC has not agreed that there's karst, even though the evidence is unmistakable, there are parts of DEC that I've dealt with in other projects where they do recognize karst. So one hand is not talking to the other.
I'll be happy to write 3 or 4 draft letters to a variety of different people and to encourage people to use those drafts, but also to put in your own personal angle on it, your own personal story. My kids play in the field. My kid goes kayaking in the river. I do that. You know, make the more different the letters are, the better. But I'd be happy to write 4 or 5 different letters that would help you.
Yep.
That would give you a practical sense for the way to approach it.
Yeah, I think as soon as we have that, then we can send it to the email list.